Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to you in the second technical session of day 2 of the 3 days international webinar on Neither East nor West, Vistas of Postcolonial Discourses, being organized by Department of English, Women's College, Agartala, Tripura, India. In this session, we have with us two great literary personalities like Professor Mashrur Shahid Hossain from Jahangirnagar University, Dhaka, Bangladesh, and Dr. Rita Banerjee, retired professor in English, Center for English Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. I, on behalf of the organizing committee and on my own behalf, passionately welcome both of you in our webinar. With the permission of Professor Mashrur Shahid Hossain, may I introduce to to the audience?
Yes, carry on.
Yes, Mashrur Shahid Hossain is a professor of English at Jahangirnagar University, Dhaka, Bangladesh. He teaches, publishes, and presents papers on a host of areas, ranging from comparative literature, postcolonialism, critical pedagogy, cultural studies, and queer theory. His research areas also cover minority discourse, gender studies, media and communication, and research methodology. He has presently been working on 3 book length projects. First, rewriting his dissertation on violence against men in film and literature. Second, a critical survey of South Asian electronic literature. And third, developing an archipelagic approach to the pedagogy of the literatures of the British Isles. Sir has also numerous publications to his credit. Today, Sir will enlighten us all on the topic both East and West, and also how one imperializing category conceals another. Sir, please, the platform is yours, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Somali, for the generous introduction. Yes, good afternoon to all, and welcome to my presentation on the topic. The title of the topic, that is both East and West, and also is somehow in kind of contrast or in complementary relation with the title of the webinar itself, that is Neither East nor West. So therefore, and the subtitle also suggests that it is going to be about the clumsiness of categorization and how one categorization conceals another categorization. And with this, I will approach the study of English literature, particularly the study of Anglophone literatures of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. And with this, I would like to approach postcolonialism with a difference. Throughout my presentation, I would like to use PowerPoint. The reason being that it is there are lots of elements, names, and other things which the audience will find useful if I use the PowerPoint. So, yes. So let me know, Somali, if you see the PowerPoint and if it is broadcast.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I can see, sir.
Fine. Okay. So I think everyone can see the PowerPoint. Okay. So this is the title that I say that both East and West, and also how one imperializing category conceals another. Now, and I will take around 40 to 45 minutes to do my presentation. Now, with a view to entering directly into the contention I offer, I will start with an example that is reading, and that is of a very well-known poem by William Wordsworth, an English romantic. Let's partially recap the poem. I think we know this, but again, recap this for to facilitate our discussion. This is the beginning of The Solitary Ripper. Behold her, single in the field, yon solitary highland lass, reaping and singing by herself. Stop here, or gently pass. Alone she cuts and binds the grain and sings a melancholy strain. Oh, listen, for the vale profound is overflowing with the sound. Will no one tell me what she sings? Perhaps the plaintive numbers flow. For old, unhappy, far off things, and battles long ago. And then the ending. I listened, motionless and still, and as I mounted up the hill, the music in my heart I bore, long after it was heard no more. Now, what
Sir,
I
can
would
I
like,
interrupt you? Sir, can I
yes, yes,
interrupt you for a
yes,
bit?
yes, yes,
Sir,
yeah.
please maximize the PPT, sir.
Yes,
Please press
there
F5.
could
Please
be a
press
problem.
F5, sir.
Yes,
Uh,
I will do it, but there can be some problem with maximizing. But again, I do it. If there is a problem, then I will minimize it. Yeah.
Sir, go to presentation mode, sir. Yeah.
Yes.
Now it is correct, sir. Now it is fine, sir.
No, I mean there is a problem with the laptop. That's the reason I'm going this way. Yeah.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. Fine, sir.
So just let me know. Just yeah. That's the reason I was doing not. I mean, maximizing it. But I think it's visible enough, or what?
Yes, sir. It's visible,
Yeah.
sir.
Okay. So I think I would like to because I
Yeah.
this is another laptop that I'm using. Yeah. Okay. I
Yes, sir.
regret that problem. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
sir. It's not a problem, sir. Please
Yeah,
carry on,
yeah,
sir.
fine. Yes. Okay, so this is how the poem ends. That is, I listened, motionless and still, and as I mounted up the hill, the music in my heart I bore long after it was heard no more. Now, if we move into reading The Solitary Reaper in a different way, then I had some questions. It's a beautiful poem, but probably terribly beautiful. Now, my question is, when we read or teach this poem, particularly in South Asia, do we notice and take seriously the phrase, the highland lass? And do we connect Highland Lass, this image, with the rest of the poem that tells us that the speaker of the poem does not understand what the solitary reaper is singing about? Understandably, Highland refers to the Scottish Highlands, a mountainous range in the northwest Scotland. It is also known that the poem was inspired by Wordsworth's visit of Stradire, a small village in Scotland in 1803. The second question is why did the poet not understand what the girl was singing? Understandably, the girl was singing in Erse, a Scottish Gaelic language, and that's why the English speaking narrator did not understand the lyrics. Now, the distances, the spatial distance and the linguistic distance that we observe between the Scottish Reaper and the English poet are telling. The distances are telling not because here we find a famous romantic enamored by the soulful singing of an ordinary girl, immortalized her anonymously. But the distances are telling also because the visual, haptic, and auditory images of the poem betray how an English poet exoticizes a Scottish setting and a Gaelic folk song by offering a mechanism of gaze that left the girl as a lass, often used derogatorily, and by offering a mechanism of orality that left the song unassimilable. At the end, the narrator does not seem to be interested in knowing what the lyrics mean. For Jared Carruthers, the narrator here evades any engagement with the girl and rather is content with his generalized impression of what the song is about. Referencing Edward Said's explication of the way Orientalism happens, we may say that the English poet here feasts on the visual and the oral performances of an other are different. The question is how much other, how much foreign a Scottish landscape or a Scottish girl is for an Englishman. And this question leads us to an issue that non Scottish readers are likely to miss or ignore. That is the contested political cultural relation between England and Scotland and the role literature plays in strengthening or resisting the hegemonic relation. In Wordsworth's poem, what remains is solitariness, no solidarity. My today's take on the clumsiness of categorization takes into account the nuanced complexities inherent in any categorization, East or West, Global South or Global North, Orient or Occident, the complexities that we cannot and should not ignore. Thus, in our post-colonial or geopolitical discussions, when we put England on one hand and Ireland, Scotland, and Wales on the other under the umbrella term West, or British sometimes, do we consider West as something homogeneous that is essentially imperializing and inherently an opposite of the East or the Orient? If we think that way, then we commit the same mistake, the same error, the same epistemological crime that the West has allegedly met in its dealing with the Orient. This is the basic premise upon which rests my today's talk, both East and West, and also. My talk will unfold in three parts. The first part, Bestness of West, elaborates on the semantic nuances of West. The second part proposes the term literatures of the Anglo-Celtic Isles as an emancipatory alternative to the uncritical terms English literature or British literature. And the third part outlines critical archipelagic approach as an effective methodology to read and teach the Anglophone literatures of Ireland and Scotland and Wales in the English departments, particularly of South Asia. I contend that it is the both and paradigm, not the either or paradigm. It is the both and paradigm, which is an accommodative yet dialogical approach to conceptualize and communicate with the geopolitically different entities. This takes me to the first part of my presentation, the Bestness of West, that is study on categorization. Now, the recent proliferation of spatial criticism has exposed how we humans construct space and also how space constructs us. This entire animation is particularly manifest in the ways we make and name geographical divisions, say the continents, Africa, Europe, or East and West, or global North and global South. Now, we take such geographical divisions for granted as something fixed and given. We establish and disseminate particular notions about particular places, for example, civilized or impulsive, and we homogenize all states or ethnicities or people that belong to a particular geographical area, like East or West. Now, in their 1997 book, The Myth of Continents, Lewis and Wigan show how we take simplistic geographical categories rather seriously, which thus generates unconscious spatial framework that conditions our meta-geographical assumptions and shape our worldview. East and West, the two terms that this webinar takes up, East and West are meta-geographic categories, that is, categories that condition our epistemological, affective, and international interaction with those regions and other people therein. Now, a major problem of such representational category is hegemonization. I'm not asking the basic question, whose West is West? I'm rather concentrating on the Eastness and Westness of West. To start with, if Europe and North America are the two constituents of West, the more Western US has outdone its Eastern counterpart or Eastern partner, Europe, say in the realm of comparative literature in the recent years. If we stay in the same disciplinary area, comparative literature, we notice a curious game of domination and subordination between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. In the heyday of Europe-centric comparative literature, the Western European countries like France and Germany would dominate the intercontinental and international comparative study, while the Eastern European countries, including Romania, Bulgaria, and the USSR, they were struggling to chip in with no big success in the area of comparative study. A glaring example of this hegemonic division is the way Transylvania of Romania features in Bram Stoker's novel Dracula, and Transylvania became the internal Orient of Europe. Now, a major reason of this intra-Europe hegemony in the late 19th and early 20th century was the relative dominance of several West European languages, English, German, French, which are often premised upon the economic and political strength of the concerned nation-states during the age of European colonialism. Now, this combo of political and linguistic domination takes me to the focus of my today's talk, the geographical entity called British Isles, or more popularly, Great Britain, which is closely associated with our practice of English literature in South Asia. So we are taking up the concept of archipelago. We know what archipelago is. An archipelago is an extensive group of islands. For example, Andaman and Nicobar Islands. My focus today is on the British and Irish Isles. Here are some graphs or visuals. Now let me ask a common yet complicated question. If the UK, United Kingdom, competes as Team GB in the Olympics, why does it play football as individual countries like England and Scotland? A more confusing question is, do the word England in the English football team and English cricket team mean the same? The answer is no. The English cricket team comprises England and Wales. This terminological problem becomes more disorienting when someone attempts to differentiate between Britain or Great Britain, United Kingdom, and the British Isles. To be precise for today's presentation, acknowledging debates, we may say that Great Britain refers to a political island nation comprising England, Scotland, Wales. United Kingdom is a geopolitical entity comprising England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And the British Isles is a geographical or archipelagic entity that includes England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, Ireland or Republic of Ireland, the Isle of Man, and the Channel Islands. Now, finding one's way out through these complexities is not only complex. This is the map of, we can say, the British Isles. Now, finding one's way out through these complexities is not only complex, but can also become offensive. It is offensive if it puts your identity at stake. This happens with Seamus Heaney, an Irish Nobel laureate. When Irish poet Seamus Heaney was included in the 1982 Penguin Book of Comparative British Poetry, he responded with a sarcastic poem, an open letter. Let me read. I hate to bite hands that led me to the limelight. In the Penguin Book, I regret the awkwardness. But British, no, the name's not right. We understand the complex relationships or the contesting relationships between uh, England and other countries in the archipelago. Now, what we must note at the outset that Ireland, Scotland, and Wales had highly problematic political, linguistic, and cultural interaction and contest with England, and it is still on. What I intend to highlight today is the uncritical way we homogenize the category of West as essentially imperializing and orientalizing, which prompts us to ignore the fact that the politics and practice of colonization and orientalizing or othering are evident within West, between England and Scotland, for example. So let me now concentrate on one constituent of Great Britain, Scotland, and let me destabilize another category we premised upon, post-colonial. When Ashcroft, Griffiths, and Tiffin, in their 1989 book, The Empire Writes Back, excluded Scotland from the list of post-colonial countries, it created considerable uproar. The writers conceded that Ireland, Scotland, and Wales were the first victims of English expansion, but they reasoned that these countries also subsequently complicit in British imperial enterprise, which makes it difficult to identify them as post-colonial. Understandably, the Scottish writers, scholars wrote back, what emerged is that Scotland is both colonizer and colonized. Scotland had its history of colonizing the other. The Kingdom of Scotland tried its luck in overseas colonization. An infamous example is the Darien Scheme, in which Scotland attempted to colonize Panama but failed. After the dissolution of the Kingdom of Scotland in 1707, Scotland still was involved in and benefited from Britain's worldwide colonizing mission, including the system of slavery. Scottish writer James Robertson published a novel in 2003, Joseph Knight, the novel that exposed this uncharted history of Scotland. But Scotland was colonized too. For example, it merged with the Kingdom of Great Britain through the Acts of Union in 1707. However, a more notorious event was the Highland Clearances. that is, the forced eviction and migration of a huge number of Scottish Highland tenants to Scottish lowland and to North America and Australia in the name of agricultural improvement. This culture, the emigrants in Helmsdale, Scotland, is a memorial of that traumatic diaspora. Therefore, with this mixed history, Scotland has the potential to be post-colonial. Now, the term borrowed from Franz Fanon that has been used to designate post-colonial Scotland is inferiorization. That is, the discursive mechanism through which the metropolitan center makes and establishes its periphery as inferior. In their 1989 book, The Eclipse of Scottish Culture, that coincided with the publication of the Empire Rights Back, Craig Beveridge and Ronald Trumbull showed how pre-Union Scotland was portrayed by the English as dark and uncivilized, needed to be redeemed, colonized by British Enlightenment. If we see the list, it will be shocking because it matches to a great extent the list of Orientalizing provided by Edward Said. Here is a list that the writers provided to clarify how Scotland and England were put on the two poles of binary opposition in England's bid to control Scotland. So Scotland is dark and backward, and England, the enlightened and advanced entity, is there to civilize and control Scotland. Now, if we call it Manichaean inferiorization, that is inferiorization based on binary oppositions, there is also internal inferiorization regarding coloniality. For many critics, including Berthold Schoen, Scotland had history of internal colonialism. That is, while the highbrow upper class systematically oppressed the poor and played a major role in the Highland clearances, the lowland Scots, precisely the people of the Anglicized mainland Scotland, the lowland Scots dominated and inferiorized the Gaelic speaking Highlands. What I intend to stress is that when in South Asia, precisely in the departments of English, when we study Anglophone Scottish literatures or when we study English writers' representation of Scotland, as we found in William Wordsworth, also T.S. Eliot, and when we study Scots and Gaelic Scottish literature in translation, we need to critically and effectively address the England-Scotland political and literary relations against the context of the British Isles. This takes me to the conceptualization of Anglo-Celtic Isles. This is categorization, but again, I will clarify it further later. So the question is the category British Isles sensible enough? In 1993, Susan Bestness proposed the term British Isles to overcome the terminological problems that England or British and its archipelagic neighborhoods invoke. However, inclusion of the Republic of Ireland in a term that is British, like British Isles, has remained contentious. Therefore, many scholars tended to opt for Atlantic Archipelago as a less metrocentric term. In 2015, John Brannigan used the phrase Irish and British Isles in the subtitle of his book on archipelagic modernism. But I here propose a kind of different uh, term. That is, instead of Irish British Isles or Atlantic Archipelago, I opted for the term Anglo-Celtic Isles because this term has its focus on the languages that formed and informed the ethnicities of the area, and also it has a broader coverage as the word Celtic incorporates the Irish, Welsh, and Scottish Gaelic. The phrase Anglophone literatures of the Anglo-Celtic Isles designates literatures composed in English in England, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. The term invokes a network that involves a post-colonial non-metropolitan perspective to study and teach literatures in English of the Anglo-Celtic archipelago. This takes me to the second part of my talk, which is titled Between You and I on Literatures of the Anglo-Celtic Isles. Now, we have noted how Irish poet Shima Sini conveyed his dissatisfaction for being called British. His response was balanced. Not always, everyone's response was balanced. So here comes Hugh MacDiarmid, a major figure of Scottish Renaissance of the 20th century, who in his Anglophone poem The Difference dismissed the term British rather impishly. I'm a Scotsman and proud of it. Never call me British. I'll tell you why. It's too near brutish, having only the difference between you and I. Scant difference, you think? Yet, hell deep and heaven high. This difference between the you and I is not only, we understand, not only between British and British, British and British, but also between England and Scotland and corresponding nationalist, linguistic, cultural, and literary relations. It is therefore unfortunate that similar kind of uncritical, hence allegedly politically offensive activities are evident in the departments of English in the world. I too am from the Department of English. In Bangladesh, if I want to narrow my focus, the English language or Anglophone literatures of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales have been uncritically crammed under the umbrella term English literature. Thus, English literature syllabuses feature Anglophone Irish James Joyce, Anglophone Welsh Dylan Thomas, and Anglophone Scottish Muriel Spurk as English writers. This is, however, not simply for convenience, and not only to suggest literatures in English, because an Anglophone Nigerian Chinua Achebe and an Anglophone Canadian Margaret Atwood are not deemed English proper, and they are placed in separate courses, say postcolonial literatures or African and Canadian literatures. Most intriguingly, often is British deemed synonymous with English. Such British Raj-infested homogenization has led to two hegemonic pedagogic approaches. First, naturalization of the ubiquity and superiority of the literatures produced in England. And second, invisibilization, that is making invisible, of the different, often oppositional histories and trajectories of the Anglophone and non-Anglophone literatures of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. In response, my talk samples a strategy of delinking the English literature pedagogy in South Asia. So understandably, the question is, what is delinking? Delinking is conceptualized and promoted by the proponents of decoloniality. Decoloniality is critical political activism that questions the Anglocentrism of postcolonial studies. Developed chiefly by the Latin American scholars, decoloniality conceives of coloniality as an epochal condition and an epistemological frame, which is bigger than the historical projects of imperialism and colonialism. To be precise, decoloniality is chiefly about subverting epistemological and egological coloniality. In decoloniality, delinking means disconnection, that is, acknowledging the connection with the imperial center, but severing the necessity or cutting the necessity of ties with the colonial powers and establishing new geopolitical liaison. In the words of Walter Mignolo, a major decoloniality scholar, delinking is a means of breaking off from the coloniality of knowledge, controlled and managed by the theological, ecological, and organological principles of knowledge and its consequences. In a recent writing, Mignolo further clarified the proposition. Delinking involves building the knowledge we need for our own liberation, rather than contributing to the knowledge they need for our subjective enslavement. For the sake of precision, let me mention three concepts that inform delinking. The first one is the Egyptian French scholar Samir Anim's proposal for political and economic delinking, that is, delinking from the imperialist and capitalist global north. For Amin, an actual and active delinking is the submission of external relations to internal requirements, not the other way around. That is, not adjusting the periphery to the demands of capitalism, rather compelling capitalism to be customized to meet the internal requirements. The second cue lies in Annibal Cuyano's epistemic delinking, that is, delinking from the rhetoric of modernity and the logic of coloniality. The third cue lies in Belgian scholar Guy Jucque's conception of decentration. It involves self-interrogation, that is, decentering the subjecthood and narcissism. It involves simultaneous study of both the observed object and the observing subject. So delinking thus enables an individual to transcend insularity and learn from diversity. Here lies the ethical dimension of delinking and a major clue to the both and paradigm that the title of my paper invokes. So what I propose is another Brexit, that is delinking the study of Anglophone literatures of the Anglo-Celtic Isles. Now, this delinking involves three strategies: the epistemic delinking, ecological delinking, and politic-economic delinking. So, basing in on this emancipatory potential of delinking, I propose, or I dare proposing, that the general term English literature be rephrased as Anglophone literatures of the Anglo-Celtic Isles in South Asia. If it sounds quixotic, if it sounds unconvincing, but if we still want to keep James Joyce in a course named English Literature, let us rename it Anglophone Irish Literature. And it's gas. What's gas? Last year, during the processing of Brexit, European Commission announced that its working language is no more British English because UK left. Rather, its working language will be Irish English. And the Commission interpreter exclaimed, "That's going to be gas." Gas is an Irish word for amazing. And this is an example of Brexiting. Now, this takes me to the third part of my presentation. This is rather complicated thing, so I will kind of summarize what I meant by critical archipelagic approach as an effective means to read Anglophone literatures of the Anglo-Celtic Isles. Uh, so let me be brief with this short 8 slides. So if know that archipelago is an extensive group of islands. Now, when we are talking of critical archipelagic approach, archipelagic may mean the geographical nature or epistemological status or aesthetic production of an archipelago. It is important to note that archipelagic studies is different from nisology or island studies. While island studies has its focus on the island characteristics of a nation, for example, its sense of distance or nature of border, archipelagic studies is interested in the dialogic interaction between the constituents of the archipelago concerned. The focus or the premise is not that between the contest between center and periphery. Rather, it is a contest or exchange or interaction between diverse entities in a single archipelago. Now, when I say archipelagic approach, let me get back to the question I raised before. That is, if the position of James Joyce, an Irish author, in the departments of English, should we put Joyce in a differently titled course, say Anglophone Irish Literatures, and why is it needed? Addressing these paradoxes and perplexities of inclusion of Scottish and Irish and Welsh writers under English, John Brannigan wrote a useful book called Archipelagic Modernism, and where he located two modes that dominate the study of literatures of the Irish and British Isles: the Anglo-centric mode and the national narrative mode. In the Anglo-centric mode, for example, Yeats and Joyce are seen as exemplary, of metropolitan modernism, while in the national narrative or local narrative mode, Yeats and Joyce are seen predominantly in relation to Irish national traditions. Brannigan therefore proposed archipelagic as a mode of reading. In his conceptualization, the archipelagic accommodates the post-devolutionary or post-decentralization contexts of the literatures of the Irish and British Isles. For Brannigan, archipelagic mode remains sensitive to what is distinctive about the linguistic, cultural, and political histories of literature in each of the constituent parts of archipelago. I contend that archipelagic approach endorses decentration or delinking. Now, accommodating yet expanding Brannigan's archipelagic mode, I propose critical archipelagic approach as an effective means of approaching the literatures of the Anglo-Celtic Isles. I contend that critical archipelagic approach is critical affective, metacognitive, and comparative, and hence it is an effective pedagogic mechanism at the universities of South Asia to delink the study of literatures of England from the study of Anglophone literatures of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Okay, so Molly, I will take kind of 10 more minutes to finish my presentation. I think that's fine. Okay, now if we want to approach critical, enter critical archipelagic approach, let me refer to Lothar Fritz. Now we know that place is an important element in identity formation. Now Lothar Fritz, in his essay on the rhetoric, poetics, and politics of space, demonstrates how place is materially and cognitively hierarchical. That is how the construction of a place as the center reduces the neighboring places as peripheries. He thus shows how the construction of an Anglo-American center in the Anglo-Celtic Isles, that is in England, was premised upon the political rhetoric of national unity and cultural uniformity. In order to generate a non-metropolitan, non-colonial perspective, Fitz envisions a new aesthetics of space that critically defamiliarizes the autonomized and habituated perceptions and experience of place, that destabilizes centrism and regionalism, and that initiates decentralization and pluralistic parochialism. Addressing these epistemological and geopolitical dimensions of the Anglo-Celtic Isles, I conceptualize the archipelagic as a site of diatopical site of struggle for meaning, not between the center and periphery, rather between the entities that have antagonistic yet interanimating relation with each other. Now, what is diatopical? Diatopical has the resonance of dialogism, that is, dialogue or interaction between two. But here, the focus is on space, on geography. So, diatopical involves dialogic contest and interaction between topics pertaining to different places or changing spatio-temporally. To be precise, critical archipelagic approach involves mobilizing the diatopical means of exploring the relations between the constituents of an archipelago. This takes me to the basics of critical archipelagic approach that I will just uh, summarize. So, critical archipelagic approach is a way, a methodology of reading or teaching Anglophone literatures of the Anglo-Celtic Isles, including so-called English literature. So it is premised upon three features. That is, it is metacognitive, it is critical affective, and it is comparative. Let me not elaborate on this. And it involves five constituents. That is, the planning of archipelagic approach involves five constituents. The first is syllabus. So I suggest that the syllabus must have representative sampling of Irish, Scottish, and Welsh literatures from the ancient to the contemporary periods. The genre should sample all the major ones, including the ones that Scotland or Ireland are famous for. For example, folk ballads, graphic novel, horror and detective fiction. For example, Bram Stoker's Dracula and Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. Third is Englishes. Uh, The impact of the rule of Britannia is that not only English has become the world's lingua franca, but also that there is no more one English. There are Englishes. Now, when we think of Anglophone literatures of the Anglo Celtic Isles, we must not think of some standard English only. Anglophone, the term covers a bigger areas including Irish, Scottish, and Welsh variants of English. And also there are dialect and synthetic Englishes, let alone contemporary pop influenced lingo. Creative expressive method suggests that this approach includes creative writing and innovative presentation or case study as a way of interpreting literature. It also involves the use of sensorium for appreciating a literary text. For example, concentrating on the phonetic features or oral features of, for example, Shimasini's poems. And critical archipelagic interaction designates a reader's actual encounter with a literary text. So, critical archipelagic approach, the plan involves these five constituents. This is a short. I'm not going to discuss elaborate on this. That when we approach an Anglophone text of Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, the teachers or the readers may invoke these seven types of skills, senses, and sensibilities. I also propose that the critical archipelagic interaction has a contextual thing. That is, it suggests the context of critical archipelagic interaction suggests the range, that is, the areas at which this approach is useful. The first is redoing the existing approaches to Anglophone, Irish, Scottish, and Welsh literatures. For example, our approach to the teaching of Dream of the Root can be changed if we locate or identify that Dream of the Root was actually carved on a Ruthven cross, an Anglo-Saxon cross which is located in Scotland. Now, this reference to Scotland may change our appreciation of the Dream of the Root as an Old English poem, and it is important to note that the Pelican Book of Scottish Verse includes the Dream of the Root as its entry. Similarly, our approaching Shimasini's Anahorish will be different. The second context of critical archipelagic interaction is redoing the existing approaches to English literature's representation of politics. For example, reading Shakespeare's Hamlet with reference to J.W. Gaines' The Valiant Scot, so that we can have a more nuanced understanding of Shakespeare's Scottish hero, or Shakespeare's Macbeth, and also Hamlet with Danish reference. Approaching also Wordsworth, the Solitary Reaper, that we already noted. And at the end of my talk, I will show how Wordsworth's Solitary Reaper can be read differently if we read it vis-a-vis Macklin's Highland Woman. And the third is incorporating new entries. That is, Celtic writings in translation can be incorporated in our syllabuses, and also not only Beckett or Eliot, but also more contemporary writers like Caroline Duffy, Irving Welsh, and Bernice Rubens should be incorporated in the syllabuses. This takes me to the final part, that is in text. This is again a sample that I will provide. That is, when we are teaching or reading a text, for example, Shimasini's, an Irish poet's poem on Anahorish, what we should do. I propose that these are the things that we need to do in order to understand the nuances of Irishness of the poem. For example, listening to the sounds, pronouncing the words and the sounds, isolating the parochialist fundamentals, etc. Now, if this is the poem, and if it starts with "My place of clear water, the first hill in the world, where springs washed into the shiny grass, and darkened cobbles in the bed of the lane, Anahorish, soft gradient of consonant, Wobble Meadow." Just give a sample of it. That is, in reading this, it is not only needed that we highlight the Irish background of the poem, but is also needed is to highlight or practice the phonetic feature of the poem, and also the semantic one. For example, the poem proposes the meaning of Anahorish and that comes as a kind of code at the very beginning of the poem, place of clear butter. The another politics, phonetic politics, is the very word anahorish, which the English speakers are not likely to pronounce the way that we are able to pronounce with the pronunciation of ha. Now, the very inability of pronouncing the word anahorish as it is suggests the foreignness of British, of English in Ireland. At the same time, uh, it is important that, in the last part, I said that when we are reading or teaching this poem, it is important that we ask the students to locate Anahurish on the map. Ask them to do it, and they will be frustrated because Anahurish does not appear on the map because Hini's townland, Anahurish, does not exist. The question is, Anahurish also exists because it is Hini who is sitting before Anahurish Primary School. So what happens? What happens is that Anahurish is an Irish nomenclature, which is used to replace the official name Creek that we find in map. Therefore, through this, the students will be able to understand the politics of naming, the politics of renaming, and the loss of place through dispossession and migration. And what is important in critical archipelagic interaction or approach is to connect it to the student's experience of loss of name. So this takes me to the closing part of my presentation, that is the power of both and. We have noted at the very beginning that how the solitary reaper represents a Scottish girl. But of course, the Scottish writers wrote back, and there are a number of poems that wrote back, including English poem Young Highland Girl studying poetry, and Sorley Maclean's Gaelic poem, which is the most famous one, uh, Gaelic poem Ban Gwild, a Highland woman. If you read the very first two lines, because we don't have much time, you will see the difference and why it is important to couple it with the study of the solitary reaper. Hast thou seen her, great Jew, who art called the one Son of God? Hast thou seen on thy way the like of her, laboring in the distant vineyard? The load of fruits on her back, a bitter sweat on brow and cheek, and the clay basin heavy on the back of her bent, poor, wretched head. This spring and last spring, and every 20 springs from the beginning, she has carried the cold seaweed for her children's food and the castles revered. Now, what is important to note is that in this poem, the writer, that is Sorley Maclean, in its Gaelic version, reverses the imperializing or exoticizing gaze of Wordsworth. Just one sample is that here, as some critics suggest, that the writer reverses a master metaphor of imperialism, that is Christ, the universal figure of sacrifice and salvation. If you look at the use of the word carrying, that suggests that instead of carrying, that in place of Christ carrying some absurd cross or abstract cross, here is a woman, a struggling woman who is carrying cold civets for her children. It also somehow refers to castle, that is, the landlords who demand for their shares of women's labor. And also, near the end of the poem, there's reference to church, which has its reference to the clearances, the Highland clearances. Wordsworth's celebrated poem, Solitary Reaper, is silent about all these issues. So what is important, what I suggest is that critical archipelagic approach aligns Wordsworth's Anglophone poem and Sorley Maclean's Gaelic poem in translation, so that a reader may reach both a nuanced understanding of English and Scottish Romanticism and a nuanced understanding of the writer's participation or lack of participation in the political, cultural, and memorial interactions between England and Scotland. This is the power of both and paradigm. The notion of unity and diversity, of oneness, is arguably a quintessential Asian experience. The Upanishadic one spirit Tattam Vasi, Vedantic notion of Dvaita Dvaita or Dvaita Dvaitavad, the sophistic appropriation of Wahdat al Wujud, and the Chinese yin yang all testify to a spirit that embraces pluralism, but not at the cost of individual dignity. Such a spirit stands in contrast with the Western dialectical model of binarism, of conflicting dualism, which is grounded on the either or paradigm. Thus, which is what is not chosen is othered or discarded. A literary example of such binary opposition is Aristotle's division of drama into two, tragedy and comedy. Vis-a-vis such self-centric thinking stands the South Asian holistic model of harmony, of complementary dualism, which generates the both and paradigm, whole, inclusive, cooperative. In these coexisting but competing systems, choosing one and discarding the other is not imperative. Rather, they can and do coexist. A literary example of such holism is evident in Dasarupa, the 10 forms of play explicated in Bharat Muni's Natya Shastra. So, in my reconceptualization, the both and paradigm does not intend imposition of some homogenizing oneness on the diverse humanity, nor does it endorse uncritical conformity, nor does it ignore the individuation of an agent. It is rather, as I mentioned, a diatopical struggle for meaning, not between some center and peripheries, rather between diverse entities that have antagonistic yet interanimatic relation to each other. Now, before I conclude, one might question how come a talk on the clumsiness of categorization closes with categorization? Yes, formulating the both and paradigm as Asian and the either or paradigm as Western runs the risk of orientalizing or occidentalizing. It is as problematic as the categories of East and West, of global South and global North, of post colonial and non post colonialism. Let me therefore clarify at the end of my talk that my position is not against categorization. Categorization or typification, that is, putting things into types, is a necessity. For epistemological and affective existence and experience, we make and rely on categorization. What is needed, what we need to do, is to be alert to the provisional nature of every category. What we need to do is to destabilize the essentialism and stereotyping that often go uncontested in the name of categorization. What we need to do is to underscore that every entity is contingent and not the final, that the interaction is not between only the two. There can be the third, there can be the fourth, there can be the many, and that's why there is both and also. This may explain the emergence of post-coloniality, where the focus is being shifted from colonial encounter to transnational encounter and ethnic, interethnic interanimation. This brings me to the close of my rather long talk on both East and West, and also how one imperializing category conceals another. Thank you for your patience for listening to me for such a long time.
Thank you so much, sir. It was a brilliant presentation. I hope that, of course, all the participants will be able to know this particular term, that is critical archipelagic approach. It's a very recent one and a very interesting one. And it was a great rereading of Wordsworth's Solitary Reaper, sir. And it's a very new and recent concept, and of course, with a spatial perspective. And sir, there are some questions from the participants' end. So the questions will be displayed on the screen, sir. You can see. Let me do this.
Yeah.
Can
Okay.
you see, sir? Can you see?
Yes. It's
Yeah.
through Majumdar. How has the interactions between the other nations of the British Isles and England conditioned the canon of English literature? Yes, it conditioned. I mean, we were talking about that the inclusion, for example, of Scottish, Irish, and Welsh writers uh, under the umbrella term English, and they contributed. greatly to the development of the canon of English literature. If start from Jonathan Swift to James Joyce to Yeats to Samuel Beckett. What I focused on is that we often eschewed or ignored uh, the different cultural, political entities of these writers, and they are often put under the same category of English. So, not only the study of Anglophone Irish writings or Anglophone Scottish writings, but also English writings itself, themselves. That is, how Anglophone Irish or Scottish writings represent itself, represent Ireland or represent Scotland, and also how English writing, that is, literatures of England, represent Scotland or Ireland. It is important to read them or study them from a critical archipelagic approach. It is only then that we will be able to understand the assumed superiority of English and also the contribution of the, as you wrote, other uh, nations of the Anglo-Celtic Isles.
Yes, sir. There is another question.
Under the aegis of decoloniality, can be or should we also look for the interaction of dominant and subordinate cultures, knowing that the interaction can never be on an equal footing? Necessarily so. When we are talking of, I mean, there are 2 points in it. Let me be brief. One is that when we're talking dominant and subordinate cultures, first thing is that the decoloniality questions the very Anglocentrism of postcolonial studies. I mean, it came up as a response to postcolonialism. That is, postcolonialism somehow reduced the discussion of colonialism into English colonizations. It focused less on, for example, the colonization of America, the colonization of Latin America. So therefore, decoloniality itself is critical of English centrism. But when we are talking of the dominant and subordinate cultures, there are two kinds of things. One is if we think England as dominant and Ireland or Scotland as subordinate, then there is kind of interaction. But within Scotland, as I said, within Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, there is an internal colonialism. So within Scotland, there can be a hierarchical relationship between poor and rich, man and woman, highland and lowland, uh, English speaking and non English speaking Scots, for example. So the nuances are much deeper, and therefore the study must involve or can involve approaching them as contesting cultures, but also at the same time complementary cultures. So reading of one involves reading or knowing of the other. That is something what I propose in critical archipelagic approach.
Yes, sir. Sir, another one is waiting, sir.
Sir, is it not also delinking the modern post-colonial writings written from our continent too? Yes, sure. Native Indian, immigrant, Bangladeshi, American, Pakistani, lots of variety. How to study them? Okay. Yes, I mean, this focuses on the critical archipelagic approach. Uh, this is a focus study. Focus study, I somehow outlined it at the very beginning, that this study is based on archipelagic identities or entities. There are two types of two types of entities, aspects of archipelagic entities. One is the island entity. That is, island is separated from the other, separated from the so-called mainland. And therefore, it has a very unique kind of identity with reference to ocean and distance from the other. That is important. Another is when several islands form a single entity, which is called macro region, like the Anglo-Celtic Isles. Then they have other political and cultural interaction. Now, this is particularly offered for the study of Irish, Scottish, and Welsh literatures. Same approach might be applicable with some differences when we study Native American literatures, maybe in English or in their own languages, the diasporic Bangladeshi literatures or diasporic Bangla literatures and other literatures which are often crammed under post-colonial as well. So yes, a similar, not the same approach, but the similar approach can be used and should be used to mobilize more accommodative reading of post-colonial literature particularly, and any kind of literature in general.
Yes, sir. Another one, sir, I'm posting here.
How do you want to define the position of Shakespeare? Okay, yes,
Okay.
interesting question, a common question, but of course it has lots of there are lots of things to answer. Uh, Shakespeare uh, is considered both as revolutionary and also completing the center. For example, when Shakespeare was promoted in the in the colonial countries, he was presented as something harbinger or carrier uh, of imperialism or the power of the king. But also, we know that in England, or even during Shakespeare's time, his plays can also be read as revolutionary. Uh, and also Ngugi wa Thiong'o talked about it. Now, Shakespeare is therefore, it depends on how you use Shakespeare. On one hand, Shakespeare's representation of Macbeth uh, is problematic. If we read the Valiant Scot, where we find representation of a Scottish king from Scottish perspective, while Shakespeare's was a kind of representation of Scottish king from more English or the center perspective. Uh, but at the same time, how we see Macbeth can be changed when we put Macbeth into adaptation. For example, when Vishal Bharadwaj adapted Macbeth as Mughal in India, we find that he made Macbeth a Muslim, that is Maqbul. And this is important because in the context of England, in the context of the domination of England, Scotland has that marginalized entity that Muslims are allegedly have. Muslims allegedly have in India. So therefore, the connection between the problematic interaction between a position of a Muslim in India has some resonance in the position of the Scots in the context of Anglo-Celtic Isles. So my answer is that positioning Shakespeare depends on us. But of course, there are many plays of Shakespeare which can be called racist. For example, The Tempest.
Yes, sir. Fine. Sir, another last question, sir. Uh, let's see.
What is the difference between Ireland and South Asian partition literature? Oh, I mean, I think the focus is on the partition. Uh, well, if you think of partition, then the history of partition that Ireland or particularly Scotland has is different from the history that South Asia has. So, as we said that, um, on one hand, these two can be comparative in the sense that it involves similar kind of experience, that is Scottish or Irish uh, partition, particularly if we say Ireland's or Scotland's uh, dissolution as independent countries, and then again, I mean, they are merging with the merging with the Great Britain, the United Kingdom, and then their attempt, some failed attempt, some successful attempt to dissociate themselves from the Great Britain. Scotland has not yet succeeded much. Ireland succeeded partially with the Republic of Ireland. Now, this experience can be connected with the experience of South Asian partition. I mean, if we consider 1947 partition, if this is the similarity, there are differences that, as we noted, that there is a kind of archipelagic or island-centric um, differences. For example, Ireland is separated by land from England, and this is, while Scotland is not. Now, this is important, something that is not evident in South Asian partition story or partition event. Here, it's a land. I mean, all the all the areas or the people are connected through lands. But this is not the case with Ireland and England. So they are separated by land. So therefore, archipelagic approach must keeps into account these differences. So here lies the difference between Irish and Scottish partition, or I say dissociation from United Kingdom, and South Asian partition experience.
Sir, here is another one. Actually, sir, I missed it, but the participant posted it twice. So, sir, can I
Yes, yes.
go for that? Yes, sir.
Why the term world literature still exists? Moreover, now in present times, the art, music are even categorized in this category. Okay, actually, answering this question demands another presentation. Okay, two questions are there. One is why the term world literature still
Sorry.
exists. Well, world literature as a term came not even before 200 years, so it's rather a recent, I mean, in a sense, recent phenomenon. It exists. There is no problem with this categorization. As I said, that categorization happens because it's a necessity. To understand people, I need to categorize person as non-animal, as man or woman. That is a necessity. What is important is to understand and resist the essentialism or uh, stereotyping inherent in that categorization. So the world literature is less problematic term if we if we understand its politics. Just one example, do we consider in South Asia, do we consider English literature as world literature? The answer is no. Somehow we consider Bangla literature or Indian Kashmiri literature and then English literature. World literature is something that we cannot read, probably cannot read in its original language, for example, French literature maybe, or literatures which are neither Indian or Bangladeshi or nor English, for example, African literature. But the question is, why do we not put English literature as, consider English literature as world literature? On the other hand, an Englishman considers world literature as something that we do not consider. For example, for them, Indian literature is world literature, but for you, it is not world literature. So therefore, it is contingent, and we need to be aware of the politics it involves, so that there is no question of hierarchy. The last question was that why world literature involves song, etc. World literature usually does not involve. It is usually comparative literature that involves uh, comparative reading of, for example, film and literature, literature and theater, literature and music. The thing is that world literature or comparative literature can include or can incorporate music or film with a condition that at least one aspect of the comparison, at least one object of comparison should be literature. So if there is a comparison between Shakespeare's Macbeth and Vishal Bhartwaj's Makbul, that can be considered as that is valid for comparative literature. But if we consider two film adaptations of Macbeth, then it might not be valid for literary study. Then it might be okay for film studies or other studies. So at least one phenomenon should be literature. Then it is possible to discuss two phenomena under comparative literature, if not world literature. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. You have devoted a great amount of time to us, and it was a very crystal clear presentation. Of course, you have answered to so many queries, sir. It is really an excellent, of course, an interesting one. And thank you so much, sir. We are really enlightened, sir, by your lecture. And we hope that in the near future also, sir, we will get you amongst us with another type of lecture, an interesting one, of course, sir.
Thank you for your
Sir, thank you.
invitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, very much. We invite you, sir, to attend the other sessions also, because
Sure.
after you, there is another lecture by Dr. Rita Banerjee.
Yeah.
You can attend that one
Yes, I
also,
will.
sir. So, very good wishes for your future endeavors, sir. Thank you so
Thank
much. Uh, Good afternoon, madam.
Good afternoon.
Madam, yeah, can you hear me, ma'am? Yes.
Sure, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, but madam, you are not visible, ma'am.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine, ma'am. Yeah,
Um,
okay, ma'am. Mm,
okay. I would just like to do this
yeah, ma'am. Okay, ma'am, I am just giving you
PowerPoint,
the
but
solo one.
I
You
need
want to
to
do
put.
the PPT?
Yes.
Okay, ma'am. Please, madam, wait for a minute, ma'am. Uh, Actually, madam, now I would like to request our HOD madam to introduce you to the learned audience. Sharvin madam,
Yeah.
please.
Thank you, Somali. Thank you, Somali. So, welcome, ma'am Rita Banerjee, and I'm going to introduce her to all the participants. Dr. Rita Banerjee has recently retired from the Center of English Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. New Delhi. She has completed her PhD in English from Northern Illinois University, Illinois, USA. She has just completed her term as a fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, New Delhi. She is specialized in early modern literature and has published articles in Iteris Anglicis, studies in philology, comparative drama, among others. Her current research interests include travel narratives, historiography, 19th and 20th century Bengali literature, Rabindranath Tagore, women's writings, cultural studies, etc. Her edited book, Cultural Histories of India, Subaltern Spaces, Peripheral Journals, and Alternate Historiography will be published by Routledge in October this year. Her book, representing India in 17th century English travel narratives, ethnography, Protestantism, and Enlightenment, is being published by Brill Leiden and will be released in February March 21. She had been a research secondment at Trinity College Dublin, Ireland during May-August 2016. She also had been a visiting researcher at the Institute of Ethnology in Osaka University of Japan during 2013. She was awarded research fellowship at the Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla in 2010. She also had been a visiting fellow at the University of Cambridge during 2008-9. She has published extensively in national and international journals and books. Today, Madam will deliver her lecture on postcolonialism, subalternity, and Mahashata Devi's fiction. Welcome, ma'am, and the platform is all yours.
Thank you very much for your introduction. Uh, I would have to do this PPT. I am not quite sure.
Yes, ma'am, you keep on trying. I think it will work.
I'll go share screen. No.
Yes, ma'am. Our technical committee members can help you, ma'am. They are also here.
Hello, good afternoon, madam.
Okay. Good afternoon.
Can you hear me, madam?
Pardon? Yes, I can hear you.
So I will be guiding you. There's no problem. Have you opened your PPT in your desktop?
Yeah,
Your PPT is open, right?
right.
Okay, so now you can go below. You'll see share screen. You'll see share screen. Can you
Share
see
screen, yeah.
below? Yes. So
Yeah,
you just
I
click on
clicked
that.
on that.
So you can share. There will be
I
three
clicked
options. You
on
can
that.
say your application window.
Um, Follow these steps.
Yes, just give share. After you give share screen, just
Okay,
click on share.
it comes. Oh, share screen again. Oh, yeah, you're right.
Yes, and share.
Okay, yeah,
Click on share.
application window.
Application tab.
I
Just
clicked on
click on.
share. Now I click on application.
Yes, in the application window, can you see your PPT open? One of the option will be your PPT.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Click on that. Click on that.
Right.
Have you clicked on that?
Yes.
Yes, I can see it, madam. Don't worry, I can see it. I can see it, madam. So you
Okay.
can give a full screen. Put it in full screen.
Okay.
In the show mode. Put it in show mode. Or press F5. Press F5.
F5.
Yes. Press F5.
I'm sorry, I got it. Yes, thank you.
It has come.
Then how do I move on to the next one?
Madam, that is done. You are being shown. No problem. This is the process. Now you can carry on with your lecture.
Thank you.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, all of you, and thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for attending my talk today. Um, okay. I'm talking about post-colonialism, subalternity, and Mohashida Devi's fiction. I'm afraid I can't move it to the next slide. Okay. Um, there are various significations of the term post-colonialism, ranging from a historical transition, an achieved epoch, to a cultural location, a theoretical stance, etc. I was quoting Benedict Barry. The term post-colonialism is therefore, by definition, fluid, polysemic, and ambiguous. Post-colonial studies originated at the end of the period of decolonization, which took place at different points of time for different countries, but mostly in the aftermath of the Second World War. It is a historical fact that nationalism, restoration of community, assertion of identity, emergence of new cultural practices as a mobilized political force instigated and then advanced the struggle against Western domination everywhere in the non-European world. This is from Shahid, unquote. While the growth of nationalism during the colonial period and the period of decolonization played an important role, the decolonization brought in its wake disillusionment. There were, quote, increasing division and oppression on the basis of class, religion, ethnicity, and gender, and the failure of the unquote, and the failure of the economy in the third world countries to create an egalitarian society, which resulted in the lack of participation of a large section of the population in the democratic processes. Unquote. The acceptance of post-colonial studies in the academic curricula in various countries resulted in projects of unmasking
Hello, madam.
yeah,
May I
I'm sorry, I went back. I made a mistake. But now I
actually,
think,
no, madam,
yes,
may I interrupt you? I'm so sorry to
sure.
interrupt you.
Yeah.
I think your PPT is shown just half. There is some
Oh
problem
no.
with your PPT?
No, I can see. I think I'm going wrong somewhere. Then I could. Okay. Should I? What do I do?
You just press escape. Press escape.
Okay, then escape is F
Just
something.
press escape.
Yeah. I pressed escape. Yeah,
Okay,
I did that.
okay. I'm removing it from the screen. I'm removing it from the screen. I will be adding it again. So can you please share
Okay.
it again?
Okay.
So can
So
you
once
share
you
it
remove it,
again?
should I just close it down? Should I just close it?
Yes. So, madam, you just share it this way. Just share it this way. Please don't press F5 anymore. Okay, madam.
Okay. Okay.
Uh,
So you can see it.
yes, now we can see it.
Okay, it's half the screen, I guess, but I'm afraid it won't be any better than perhaps. Should I try to close it down and open again? Do you think I should close it down and open again? Can you hear me? Can you see this now? Oh my God, what happened? Can you hear me? Can you see this? Oh no. Oh no. Hello.
Madam,
Hello.
madam,
Oh, okay. And you can see the. I'm so sorry. I wasted this time because I couldn't hear you. I tried to. Okay, I'll just do this quickly.
okay. Madam,
Okay. Okay. Thank you. I'm very sorry.
madam, you can continue.
I
Can you hear
understand.
me, madam?
Yes, I can hear you now. Thank
Okay,
you.
so please add your PPT again back to the stream.
It is there on the screen. I think I'll just give up the PPT.
No,
It
madam,
is
it's
on the.
perfectly fine. You can share it again, no problem. It's perfectly
Oh, I
fine.
got
I'll
it.
add it to the stream. Close it and share it again because by mistake you have removed it from the stream.
Oh, okay. Share screen.
Yes.
Screen. Yeah. Can you see it now?
Yes, I can see it, madam.
Okay,
Yes,
I'll just go ahead.
everything
I'm
is fine.
wasting
You
so
can
much
continue,
time.
madam. Yes, yes,
Thank you
madam.
so
Don't
much. I'm
worry.
so sorry I'm wasting everybody's
No,
time.
no, it's okay, madam. So you can please continue. Okay,
Uh,
madam.
the acceptance of post-colonial studies in academic curricula in various countries resulted in projects of unmasking and critiquing the operational effects of colonial ideology, not only in imperialist or colonialist texts, but across the literary board in canonical and popular texts of the colonizing countries, which may be, quote, culturally constrained and ideologically inflected by, unquote, by such ideology. Postcolonial, Postcolonialism informed the pedagogy in various university departments as well. To the extent that the ideological legitimation of colonialism took the forms of denigration of native culture and a silencing of native voices, the responses of the colonized to colonialism included centrally an ideological dimension in which colonial representations were contested and the validity and integrity of native cultures reclaimed. Just from side. The recovery of the native voices or the voices of the colonized is a central agenda of post colonial studies. The authenticity of the native voice and whether a recovery is possible has, of course, been the subject of debate. Post-colonialism of necessity rejects Eurocentrism. I think I went okay. In Gayatri Spivak's view, post-colonial positionality involves, quote, the assumption of a deconstructive philosophical position towards the logocentrism and identitarian metaphysics underpinning Western knowledge, unquote. Postcolonial studies consider Eurocentrism as a hegemonic mode of conceptualization whose structuring propensities are so deeply and insidiously layered that they cannot but be determinative of all scholarly production on questions relating to Europe and its others. Unquote. On this reading, Eurocentrism is not susceptible to critique since it is entailed in the very fabric of modern thought, scholarship, knowledge production, and disciplinarity. During the 80s, the subaltern studies group in India came into prominence, and subaltern studies became an important part of post-colonial studies. However, one finds in the post-colonial, if we consider the word post in terms entirely of its chronological significance, right, in post-colonial writings, a privileging of the voices of elite, often Western-trained intelligentsia, so that the popular voice is completely silenced and suppressed. Post-colonialism in the erstwhile colonized countries involved a dawning awareness that similarities with the colonial representations were often apparent in the presentation of the common people by the elite, educated, middle class, the rich, powerful, often Western educated sections of the population. The subaltern studies group sought as a corrective to retrieve and recover the voices of the people, and it is this shift that has driven post-colonial endeavors towards theorizing on subaltern consciousness and popular practice during the 80s and later. The progressive intellectual response since the 1980s has been to raise again the question of the people, to redirect attention to the disenfranchised sectors of the society, which form an overwhelming majority of the population, and to insist that both reclamation of tradition and the reconstruction of national culture after colonialism require a recovery of popular consciousness across the full range of its social articulations. Post colonialism has given rise to an attempt to adequately theorize popular consciousness and popular practice. There are today a variety of histories from below, insurgent sociologies, new approaches in political economy, developments in anthropology, social anthropology, feminist and environmentalist work in all sectors of the social sciences. Social sciences. Subaltern studies owed a great deal to history and especially anthropology. The subaltern, as Spivak points out, is conceived in terms of difference rather than identity. In volume 1 of Subaltern Studies, Ronit Guha defines the subaltern as this quote, the social groups and elements included in this category Okay. The social groups and elements included in this category represent the demographic difference between the total Indian population and all those whom we have described as the elite. Unquote. In a discussion on the postmodern condition, Gayatri Spivak says, our view of history is a very different view. It is also cumulative. But it's a view where we see the way in which narratives compete with each other, which one rises, which one falls, who is silent, and the itinerary of the silencing rather than the retrieval. Spivak says about the Subaltern Studies Collective that they generally perceive their task as making a theory of consciousness or culture rather than specifically a theory of change. And they do not allow themselves sufficiently to state that they are themselves bringing hegemonic historiography to a crisis. She sees the Subaltern Studies group resorting to deconstruction in their work and finds and reads in their work a theory of change as the site of displacement of function between science and systems. According to the Subaltern Studies group, elite historiography on the right, on the left, nationalist or colonialist, is itself shown to be constituted by cognitive failures. By foregrounding subaltern history, the group disrupts the grand narration of the nation. Grand narrative of the nation, I'll come to this later. Subaltern Studies group questioned humanism, following West European structuralists, post-structuralists like Foucault, Michel Foucault, Roland Barthes, and Lévi-Strauss. These structuralists questioned humanism by exposing its hero, the sovereign subject as author, the subject of authority, legitimacy, and power. There is an affinity between the imperialist subject and the subject of humanism. But Spivak notices the fault lines in the subaltern group's critique of humanism. They discuss consciousness as agent, totality, and upon a culturalism that are discontinuous with the critique of humanism. On the one hand, therefore, the subaltern group engages in a critique of humanism. On the other, they talk of retrieving consciousness as agent. She notes the contradiction in their characterization of peasant action and famine as in rebellion, reflecting a single underlying consciousness, and solidarity seen as a signifier of consciousness. However, consciousness suggests, quote, an indivisible self-proximate signified ground, unquote, while what is being actually referred to is a historically specific consciousness. And Ranajit Guha does make this distinction between transcendental consciousness and consciousness that's specific to a rebellion or a historical circumstance, suggesting that once the narrative of a peasant rebellion is assimilated to the hegemonic narratives, say of the nation, of the Raj, of the people, the historian surrenders his responsibility to examine the specificity of the rebellion and ascribes it to the transcendental consciousness. Spivak detects in the work of the Subaltern Studies group a latent suggestion that the subaltern consciousness is subject to the cathexis of the elite, that it is never fully recoverable, that it is always askew from its received signifiers. Indeed, it is effaced even as it is disclosed. It is irreducibly discursive, unquote. One view is to perceive subaltern consciousness as negative consciousness, the consciousness of the oppressors rather than that of the being of the subaltern. However, in the elementary aspects of peasant insurgency, Ranajit Guha suggests how the peasant insurgent consciousness may be discovered from the reports, judgments, laws produced by authorities and men in their employ. So, according to Spivak, the subaltern studies group are guilty of a contradiction. Now, I would just quote what Guha has written. It is, of course, true that the reports, dispatches, minutes, judgments, laws, letters, etc., in which policemen, soldiers, bureaucrats, landlords, usurers, and others hostile to insurgency register their sentiments, amount to a representation of their will. But these documents do not get their content from that will alone, for the latter is predicated on another will, that of the insurgents. It should be possible, therefore, to read the presence of a rebel consciousness as a necessary and pervasive element within that body of evidence. Unquote. Guha argues that the rebel consciousness emerges from the intercepted speech by authorities, messages and rumors circulating within a community, snatches of conversations overheard by spies, or records of statements made by prisoners during police interrogation. They may sometimes be, the police use these records, sometimes for use in pacification campaigns, legal enactments or judicial proceedings, and other interventions of the regime against its adversaries. Although the Raj used them in counterinsurgency measures, they nevertheless testify to the consciousness of the rebel peasantry and may quite legitimately serve as evidence for a historiography not compromised by the authorities' point of view. So, according to Guha, it is possible to recover or retrieve the popular consciousness, the rebel consciousness. According to Spivak, however, the subaltern consciousness may be perceived as the subaltern subject effect. A subject effect which operates as a subject, in her view, may be part of an immense discontinuous network of strands. That may be termed politics, ideology, economics, history, sexuality, language, and so on. Different knottings and configurations of these strands, determined by heterogeneous determinations, which are themselves dependent upon myriad circumstances, produce the effect of an operating subject. And thus, do the text of counterinsurgency locate, as in Guha's predication above, a will as the sovereign cause, when it is no more than an effect of the subaltern subject effect, itself produced by a particular by the particular conjunctures called forth by the crisis meticulously described in the various subaltern studies volume. The collective consciousness that Guha and others of the subaltern studies group posit, according to Spivak, in adhering to the essentialist notion of consciousness, would invite anti-humanist critique. Yet they themselves participate in the anti-humanist rhetoric of Barthes, which reveals the contradiction. In remaining committed to the subaltern as a subject of history, the subalternists in India reveal the limits of the anti-humanist critique of the West. As Guha has written in Subaltern Studies, Volume 4, yet we propose to focus on this consciousness as our central theme, because we do not wish to make sense of the experience of insurgency merely as a history of events without a subject. So even if they're guilty of, according to Spivak, they're guilty of a contradiction, they also reveal the limits of the humanist critique of the West. Now, here I would like to discuss three texts of Mahashita Devi here, which focus on the consciousness of the subaltern. Two of them are narratives of insurgency. The first has a historical source, while the second is fictional. The first is Oranye Rodika, Right to the Forest, which is based, or Right of the Forest, which is based on the life of Birsa Munda. The second is Choti Munda, a fictional narrative which carries on the story of Mundari insurrection in liberated India. The last text is a late novella, Pterodactyl, Puran Sahe, and Pirtha. In his Nation and Narration, Homi Bhabha discovers an ambivalence about the concept of the nation. In that large and liminal image of the nation, there is a particular ambivalence that haunts the idea of the nation, the language of those who write of it, and the lives of those who live it. In the contemporary world, Bhabha sees the concepts of national culture and historical traditions being redefined. The very concepts of homogeneous national cultures, the consensual or contiguous transmission of historical traditions, or organic ethnic communities as the grounds of cultural comparativism, are in a profound process of redefinition. Bhabha talks of the national cultures being produced from the perspective of disenfranchised minorities. Partha Chatterjee suggests that there are many instances of how the condition of colonial rule, which posits the other as radically different and therefore by definition inferior, is replicated in non-colonial situations, even within populations that the modern institutions of power presume to have normalized into a body of citizens, endowed with equal and non-arbitrary rights. This is what we see in Devi's narratives on tribals who do not feature in the success story of mainstream India. However, Birsa Munda's uprising or Ulgulan goes back to British India. In 1890, this was in 1895-1900, which was chiefly dominant in the Munda belt of Kunti, Tamar, Bangaon districts of the Bengal Presidency, which is currently Jharkhand. It demonstrates that if we make the story of the rise of nationalist resistance to imperialism the centerpiece, the role of the indigenous subaltern must be excluded. So, okay. So Birsa Munda's uprising, as well as the subaltern histories of indigenous movements, show us that if we make the story of the rise of nationalist resistance as the main or the chief narrative of India, the role of the subaltern must be excluded. Then one must argue that no organized resistance to imperialism was possible until, as in the formation of Benedict Anderson's formulation, the colonized countries acceded to sentiments of nationhood. It must be accepted that it was only then that genuine anti-imperialist resistance developed. And one must ignore many instances of subaltern resistance during the colonial and pre-colonial period. Birsa Munda's movement was just one such resistance movement, and Marshita Devi's biography focuses on that. By emphasizing Birsa's presentation of himself as Dharti Aba, or the father of the earth, Devi suggests that Birsa's movement for the ownership of Mundari land was also a struggle to preserve the environment and land against capitalist exploitation. Devi's narrative counters the version of Birsa's history propounded by the British as that of a failed attempt by a trickster to gain leadership by projecting himself as a godhead for personal gain. The British dubbed him a fraudulent miracle worker who talked of sheep kneeling before him, a bullock saluting him, and the lightning turning his body yellow like the yolk of an egg and then transforming it into white like cotton. Both the government and missionary version and the later Adivashi version of the Birsite rebellion and Birsa Munda as the leader rely on hearsays and rumors centering on Birsa. In subaltern studies, one notices an importance of rumor, hearsays, oral history. In the elementary, and all three texts of Devi actually show this. In the elementary aspects of peasant insurgency, Ranajit Guha discusses rumor as a means of communication among the subalterns. He suggests rumor offers immense possibilities for use in insurgency. Rumor does not belong to anyone. It evokes camaraderie because it has no recognizable origin or source. It belongs to every reader or transmitter. Its characteristics of anonymity and transitivity lend it a free form and allow a fair degree of improvisation, quote, as it leaps from tongue to tongue. Spivak characterizes it as a form of illegitimate writing, which contrasts with authoritative writing like law, thereby enabling its suitability for subaltern speech. Although some consider rumor as immediate, unpremeditated utterance, which are not conscious devices used to rally the people deliberately, but spontaneous statements which move the subalterns by the force of their ideology. But the authorities sometimes consider these hearsays as motivated to incite insurgency, as for instance they did in the Mundari rebellion. The missionaries and the government personnel refer to such stories intending to trivialize and satirize Birsa's actions as evidence of his fraud. In the news from Muru, Reverend Lastri, it's July and October 1895, Reverend Lastri observed, I now began to think this nonsense had been going on long enough. If the cattle were to be allowed to eat up all the crops, the result would undoubtedly be a famine. And it was supposed that Birsa had told his followers to let loose the cattle on the field. As a matter of fact, besides his doing his best to produce a famine, Birsa had pre-announced one. So, as I said, I thought it was time to do something to stop this nonsense. I accordingly sent a note to the DC suggesting that he should take some steps in the matter. The missionaries deflated Birsa as an unprincipled fanatic who was being canonized by some people anti-missionary and anti-Christian. They objected to his being called Bhagwan, Dharti Aba, and Avatar, and said that the Munda Catholic women felt insulted at his name and their picture being on saris and his picture being on saris, as Birsa had a dubious moral character. The official report selectively foregrounded certain hearsays and rumors to reinforce the figure of Birsa as a trickster, whose incitement to rebellion was motivated by his desire to propagate his own image as a divinity. However, the official version by and large sought to underplay the political and economic purposes of the rebellion, which also emerged from these rumors and anecdotes circulating around Birsa. I would suggest that in Devi's interpretation, they follow a different trajectory. The government and missionary narrative had since then been contested by other narratives. Significantly, even in the counter-narrative, as conceded in a confidential report sent by local authorities in 1940, the counter-narrative suggests that the real reason for Birsa Munda's endurance in popular memory was political. It is a fact that Birsa Munda's name is known throughout this district and outside, largely because of his rebellion and common belief that the establishment of Kundkati right was a result of his sacrifice. The local Adivasi leaders considered the advent of Birsa Munda to be the beginning of aboriginal awakening. However, there appears to be deep respect for him. The name of Birsa Munda undoubtedly stirs the Adivasis. The reference to Kundkati rights to land that Birsa tried to establish demonstrates the economic aspect of the uprising, although it has often been characterized as the uprising has often been characterized as a millenarian religious movement. Birsa's slogan was, "Let the kingdom of the Queen," which is Queen Victoria, be ended and our kingdom be established. In the estimation of Jayapal Singh, the president of the Adivasi Mahasabha, the remembrance of Birsa Munda in Mundari imagination was attributed to similar causes. The Birsa rebellion is the one best known to the administrators and the Adivasi alike. To the former, because Birsa Munda effectively forced the government of the day to meet his demands even halfway, and to the latter, because he remains the one and the only man who has concrete achievement to his credit in Adivasi reckoning. The Chota Nagpur Tenancy Acts are a living proof of the brigandage Birsa Munda had checked. In her biography of Birsa, Devi reduces the picture of the miracle worker Birsa, making him cure diseases and reduce epidemics like cholera by common sense and lessons in hygiene that he has learned in the missionary school. She enhances the vagueness surrounding some of Birsa's directives, like letting cattle loose in the fields or eating up one's crop, by insinuating that, quote, nobody knew whether all that was heard as Birsa's words was really Birsa's, unquote. Retaining his claim to godhead, Devi suggests that as a god, he foretells the misery of Mundari life and indeed of tribal life in India and summons them to resistance, struggle, and bloodshed. I am your God. I will neither take you in my lap and rock you nor deceive you with soft caress. You have been waiting for me and now you've got me. I will make you cry and give you pain. I will make you smile and give you happiness. The happiness of living free in an independent Munda land. Birsa points out the future path of action for the Mundas, the path of battle and resistance, and that is the secret of his godhead in Devi's fictional history. As I have said, in Orane Rudika, the counter-narrative of Birsa's movement for the Bundari ownership of land mingles with the cult that he popularized, Orane Udikar, or the right of the forest. While Jayapal Singh declares missionaries are being silly if they think that Birsa is worship, the Birsa cult is a myth as far as the Adivasi movement is concerned. Birsa Munda will find a place in Indian history. So he emphasizes the economic aspect of the movement rather than the religious aspect. The Birsa cult is seen by most historians as in many ways an intermixture of Mundari religion, Hinduism, and Christian practices. Strategically, Devi retains for her history the core of Birsa's religious cult, shearing off the accretions of his miracle lore. Birsa discouraged dancing, drinking, and festive celebrations during the traditional festivals of Karam, Sorai, and Holi, because such celebrations lulled them into a state of oblivion about the reality of their existence and made them lose sight of the important goal of getting an independent Mundari homeland. In his mother Kurmi's realization, Birsa as Dhartiyaba had become one with the earth. The Mundari conception of the sanctity of the earth as life-giving force of nature invests the Dhartiyaba, Birsa, with divinity. However, the sanctity of the earth and environment had clearly a different kind of relevance in Mundari life, just as it has in today's world when people are fighting environmental degradation. It is this insight of Birsa that the term Dharti Aba foregrounds, by contrasting the commercial exploitation of land by the British and the Dikus or the aliens, and the Mundari way of living in a symbiotic relationship with nature, earth, and the forest. Although Davis' work at many points shows that she closely follows the archival documentary evidence of Birsa's life and the movement that he led, there are spaces that she creates with the help of oral history and imagination. Birsa's upliftment to Godhead provides an example of the last. In case Singh records two versions of the oral tradition regarding Birsa's Godhead. The second version says how when Birsa had gone with a friend to the forest during early monsoon, he was struck by a lightning and became transfigured. His face appeared not black but red and white, etc. However, Devi locates the last story of the miracle into the dawning consciousness of Birsa as the father of the earth. The storm and lightning that appears in Arunarudika is preceded by an imaginary conversation between Birsa and Mother Earth that resonates in today's context of the environmental debates. Devi shows how she has resorted to oral tradition in order to reconstruct the story of Birsa and his movement. In the preface to Arunarudika, she writes, oral tradition cannot be defeated. Birsa became a legend because he had received a place in the oral tradition, even during his lifetime. Even in today's world, which is sick with documents and application of documents, it is necessary to attack and influence the awareness of the people with the oral tradition. It is a tested weapon of popular resistance. Birsa Munda's concept of Dharti Aba represents an existence tied to nature and characterized by the community life of shared and limited gains, and of love for land and nature, as opposed to the colonial and post-colonial narrative of conquest of nature and the trajectory of material progress depleting natural resources. As Devi says, tribal history is not seen as a continuity in Indian historiography. Yet one perceives a continuous narrative of resistance in the rebellion of Tirkamachi, 1780 to 85, the Coal Rising, 1831-32, the Santal Insurrection, 1855 to 57, the Sardar's intermittent conflicts during the 1890s, and the Birsa Uprising. The motivation for their agitations was also at bottom the same: the right to regain and own the land that they and their ancestors had tilled. The results were also similar. After each rebellion always relates to land and labor, they were evicted from their home places. In the context of the tribal world of eastern India, which is what I know, they migrated towards Bengal. They were taken to Assam as tea garden laborers, kept in Bengal to clear the mangrove forests in the Sundarbans. The indigo plant is brought. This is continuing history. There is no break in it. Choti Munda, although fictional, carries forward that narrative in the independent India, where a modified form of colonialism persisted to deprive the tribals of their land. Devi conceives her narrative as history, which tells the story of the Mundas. In her interview with Spivak, Devi says that she feels Birsa Munda's uprising could not end with the death of Birsa. By handing his arrow to Choti, Dhani Munda wishes a continuation of the tradition of Munda rebellion. The arrow, according to Devi, is a symbol for the person who will carry on that continuity. Choti is an emblem of that. Unquote. Dhani Munda served as an appropriate figure because he was Birsa's associate, the perennial rebel who had participated in the Santal Hul Kherwa struggle, the Sardar's Mulkoi Larai, and Birsa's Ulgulan. He keeps alive the story of Birsa's rebellion, the last battle against the British on the bloody Shaila Rakab Hill, which witnessed the death of so many Mundas and passes it on to another generation. Very appropriately, it is he who trains Choti to gain mastery in archery. As Birsa showed them the way, Dhani instructs Choti. Someone will show the Mundas the way again to take back the right to the forest from the encroaching Dikus and Sahibs. Dhani points at the continuity in their lives. All the reasons remain, Choti. If such a day comes, he too will kill. And yes, raise Dhani Munda's name and kill. I'll be at peace. In her essay, Women in Difference, Mahashita Devi's Dolati, the Bountiful, Gayatri Spivak shows how the decolonized state evinces signs of a colonial regime. But the political goals of the new nation supposedly are determined by a regulated logic derived from the old colony with its interests reversed. Secularism, democracy, socialism, national identity, and capitalist development. Whatever the fate of this supposition, it must be admitted that there is always a space that cannot share in the energy of this reversal. This space had no established agency of traffic with the culture of imperialism. Paradoxically, this space is also outside of organized labor, below the attempted reversals of capital logic. Conventionally, this space is described as the habitat of the sub-proletariat or the sub-order. The tribal life may be seen as a series of struggles against feudalism, moneylenders, and the police, and as time progresses against the agents of the state who prevent the implementation of the laws and rules made by the state. Choti Munda shows us how Lala Tirathram, representing the feudal forces, makes the Munda sign as bonded labor in exchange for a paltry monetary lay or a few kilograms of grain. But it is not Lala alone who is their enemy. In a period after the departure of the British, when the nation state takes on the mantle of the colonial regime, the police and the administration, along with the lumpen elements like the youth leaguers, which are the youth congress, terrorize and oppress the tribals. It is Choti Munda who teaches them survival tactics, how to fight the bonded labor system of Lala by working with Harbans, the Punjabi businessman, who gives them at least reasonable pay, and to defend themselves against ruffians or supported by the Congress government who demand shares from their weekly pay. Devi takes us to the periods of Indira Gandhi's regime and her imposition of emergency. She says 72, 75, and 75 brought in the emergency. Mrs. Gandhi's younger son, Sanjay Gandhi, and his youth congress unleashed a great deal of harassment upon the people. The region in the background of which I've written the novel was one of those areas. During emergency, nothing happened that did not happen before, although the lumpenization in the lower echelons of politics was perhaps made more systematic. In order to resist the youth leaguers, the Mundas, as well as the low-caste agricultural laborers, unite with the Adivasi activist organization headed by the educated Diku, Swarup Prasad. Theirs is a secret organization similarly named to the Naxalites, one of whom Choti had tried to help escape, but failed. Devi builds on facts here because CPIML activists were known to have found shelter in tribal villages. Despite their apparent protection of landless laborers and tribals, the AAD, which is the intelligence branch, are totally indifferent to their plight. This is Choti's understanding. In Choti's understanding, the conflict between tribals and the government is perennial. When you are government, you kill Munda Dusad without guilt. So tribal history over the years turns out to be a series of conflicts with representatives of economic systems and various governmental organs. And Choti and his arrow gains fame in the armed struggles that the Mundas undertook. Tribal history is not written or documented. According to Devi, it is a series of songs orally transmitted by the people over generations. So this is the subaltern voice, very similar to the voice that we get in the rumors. The rumors and songs are akin to each other. All the struggles, victories, and defeats of Choti get composed into songs. Songs have a kinship with rumor hearsay, as described earlier. In the words of Spivak, in this novel, by insisting like a refrain that everything in Choti's life becomes Golpo Kotha, Devi shows this is not as a deficiency, but as a creative principle itself and of history as well. The mythical power from which the Munda and the lower caste around Choti Munda draw agency and resistance from is the belief in a spellbound arrow. Choti knows that there is no spell, just regular constant practice. But his multiple interventions in Mundari life, in the matter of wages, bond labor, loans, drought, famine, harassment from political parties, um, and the successes that he has attained, get transmuted into songs of triumph. The symbol of this triumph is not Choti Munda himself, but rather his spellbound arrow. At each point when he appeals to the government for redress, when the bonded labor Dukya Munda, who had been trained by Choti, beheads the exploitative manager, when the Lala withdraws abusive words he had directed at the Mundas, or the Mundas migrate from their native place to avoid paying off unjust loan, Choti and his arrow get the credit. And he makes the Daroga, quote, makes Daroga, who represents the authority, mighty afraid, unquote. The songs produce a tribal counter-narrative to the official or landowner's version of the incidents. And it is Choti Munda focuses on the songs as a counter-narrative of resistance. At the end, Choti takes blame for the murders of the political elements who let loose a reign of terror on the Mundas. Murders he did not commit, and he warns these were murders he did not commit, but he takes blame for them, and warns the SDO of bloodshed if they raise terror on the Mundas. The octogenarian Choti hits the target with his arrow to show the SDO his shooting ability. Through Choti's act of defiance, the shooting, Devi conflates all the conflicts of the tribals over generations. The Kol rebellion, Santal Hul, Munda Sadas Larai Bisa, Munda's uprising. The arrow becomes a symbol of the perennial resistance of the tribals to mainstream politics and injustice of the state. And it is the bows raised upward by 1,000 Adivasis and the restraining hands of Chagan and his untouchable associates that replicate Choti's defiant warning when the SDO makes a move to arrest Choti. Between Choti on one side and the SDO on the other, 1,000 bows appear uplifted in the air and a warning announced in many upraised hands. Unquote. I go on to the last text of mine. Last text I've chosen, Pterodactyl, Puransa, and Pirtha. In order to understand how the tribal world is closing all its communication channels and resisting the environmental destruction unleashed by industry and development, we need to look at Devi's later novella, a very late novella about tribals, which was written almost a decade after Chotimunda. It relates the story of the descent of the disturbed soul of the ancestors of the tribals onto Pirtha. Bikya, the tribal boy, draws a picture of the ancestor's soul with chalk and then engraves, quote, a being whose wings are webbed like a bat's, body like a gigantic iguana, four clawed feet, no teeth in the yawning, terrible mouth, unquote. The picture resembles a pterodactyl, and the prehistoric visitor lands in the famine-stricken Pirtha on the night it rains. The ancestor's soul is unquiet and disturbed because their land is defined. The graves are desecrated by money-making traders and greedy moneylenders. Shankar, the only literate man among the tribals in Pirtha and the only suitable means of communication with the outside world, speaks the history of civilization's incursions into the tribal area as if he's singing a saga in a trance. He talks of the encroachments on their land, the chasing concrete roads, schools, and hospitals which destroyed their ancestors' graves, rendering them unclean and mute with pain. The unquiet ancestor's soul visits them, casts its own shadow, and hovers. The Green Revolution signifies the transition from the traditional methods of cultivation to hybridity and fast paced growth, provided by artificial methods introduced by multinational corporations, and a tearing apart of both nature and society, as an instance of neocolonialism Green Revolution features here. In Puran's first encounter with the pterodactyl, the presentist bias of the commodity cycle, symbolized by the road along which Puran travels to Pirtha, which flattens space and time, is implicitly contrasted with the fantastically revenant deep time of a past geological era. The government is not willing to. This is from David Farrier's article I just quoted. The government is not willing to accept that Pirtha is a famine-prone area because it is situated on the fringes of the Green Revolution belt of Madhya Pradesh and does not even consider sending aid on an emergency footing as it should. The Green Revolution certainly benefited the large farmers, but did very little for the poverty-stricken tribals, trapped in debt and bonded labor, who scarcely received the aid meant for them. We do not read the appearance of the pterodactyl necessarily as an eruption of the Gothic horror, as many other critics have done, but rather, as Puran suggests, as a myth and message from the start. Whether it existed in fact or not is scarcely matter. It had a message to give. And the non-tribals like Harisharan, Destio, and Puran, even though sympathetic, missed the message in their fearful or skeptical search for a real pterodactyl. In Puran's understanding, the pterodactyl visits the tribals because it has a message for them. They are aboriginals belonging to times past, but the prehistoric visitor is much more ancient, more originary than the tribals' experience. But both their existences are greatly endangered. The pterodactyl cannot communicate with the present world. Today does not know the past. The ancient, Puran himself tries to decipher its message by looking at its lidless eyes. He imagines that the pterodactyl wishes to tell the present world that just as the prehistoric animals were wiped out by geological evolution, human beings would also be eradicated by nuclear explosion or war or contemporary aggressive civilization. The technologically advanced civilizations have destroyed nature and the sustaining earth by imposing man imposed substitutes, so that the soil will not yield the crops it naturally did. Along with nature, the current generation has not honored or tried to understand, but only destroyed ancient cultures and societies, which are gradually disappearing from the earth. The unquiet soul of a destroyed ancient culture visits the restless, fast-paced, supposedly progressive modern society with its own message of warning and caution for the latter. Although to the urban journalist Puran, the prehistoric creature's eyes are unresponsive or make only half-understood signals, to Bikya it sends the message that the places it has visited belong to the tribals, and it is a message that only enhances their resolution not to abandon their abode. The hills, caves, and rivers where their ancestors' graves lay, and move to fertile plains where Kausalji or Harisharan might direct them. Pterodactyl is not a pessimistic story, as Devi insists in her conversation with Spivak. At the end, Pirtha's tribals declare that they would plant thorns and eat the tuber. They are learning to cope with the modern, they aren't accepting defeat. Besides, their silence is a form of protest, of resistance, as Spivak senses when she says, quote, that kind of uncanny silence, that resonant silence of the suburbs, which is its own kind of resistance, that's in pterodactyl, unquote. Behind this late novella, therefore, Spivak finds Devi's knowledge of the suburbs. In my consideration of the three texts, the subaltern histories, fictional histories, or alternative forms of historiography, I've tried to focus on the recovery of the subaltern agency, oral history, and subaltern resistance to the grand narrative of progress. That is all I conclude. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, madam, for such a nice presentation. Madam, there are some questions from the participants. The questions will be displayed on your screen, madam. Can you see, ma'am?
Yes, I can. And thank you very much for that question. The gendered subaltern in the works of Mahashita Devi, I think she has written, been written in one of the subaltern volumes on the subaltern is obviously twice alienated. I mean, in a way, twice subalternized. And one point about the Spivak is that she has considered that it is not possible. She has said many times, and this kind of doesn't go along with what people like Ranajit Kuhu and others are doing, is that the subaltern cannot really articulate herself.
Yes.
And this is something which a lot of people have criticized Spivak about also. Especially her talk about, especially her discussion of the sati, in which she says that the sati can only be framed in other people's narratives, in Western narratives, and she has never had a voice. So, as a subaltern, the gendered subaltern, she talks about how they lack a voice.
Yes, yes, madam. Another question, madam, I am giving you. This is the one, madam.
Autonomous identities. I mean, is this, if it is a question directed um, to me, I should think they do have discrete autonomous identities, as we see, for instance, even in the two texts, the three texts that I have considered of Devi, and if we look at them as subaltern, as instances of subaltern culture or subaltern studies, it would suggest that they are, I mean, as tribes, they are differentiated from others. And it is one kind of popular consciousnness would be a very holistic kind of categorization. And I would say subalternity as evinced in tribals, subalternity as evinced in the gendered subaltern, all these could be considered as discrete and separate entities.
Yes, madam.
Okay. And thank you for the question. I try to show that subalternity or subaltern studies. Could I just see the question again? I think there are two or three.
Yes, of course, ma'am.
Okay. Well, Mahashita Devi is certainly not a diasporic writer. She is talking about subaltern groups within the country. And subaltern studies have, I try to show that subaltern studies form a part of post-colonial studies, at least during the 80s, when the subaltern studies group came into prominence. They were subaltern studies for the recovery of popular consciousness as opposed to the elite consciousness, and the elite presentation of history became very important. And so in Spivak's writing, I would say Mahashita Devi's writings, we do notice um, the presence of the subaltern. When she is, for instance, in the biography or the biography of Birsa Munda or the uprising of the Mundari rebellion, uprising of the Mundars, of the Mundas, sorry, then she is reconstructing a history, maybe partially fictional, but it's an old form of alternative historiography, and this is very similar to what, say, Ronald Go and the others were doing at the time. So this is why I consider that we can consider Spivak's fiction as part of subaltern studies, and subaltern studies as part of post-colonial studies.
Yes, ma'am. It is another one, probably the last one.
I'm not sure why you say Mahashita's ideology is shifting. Could you clarify that a bit? Are you referring to any particular texts where she is shifting? Because I consider that she is talking about resistance everywhere, and subaltern resistance everywhere. Okay, maybe the last text. Could I get a clarification?
Yeah. Actually, I don't know what the Prashant sir wanted to ask you. Probably, madam, you just give the answer according to your particular text from where you can give the reference.
I would think that the last one, the last text that I considered, I don't know. No,
Yeah.
I'm very sorry. The last text that I considered, in which silence sort of appears as a form of resistance, would be different from the others, in which we see a more active form of resistance. And But at the same time, this is what she has discussed with Gayatri Spiva, that the very uh, the very lack of movement or the very um, reluctance to change, that would be um, a form of resistance, because it entitles it enables the tribal to preserve its tribal identity and not to shed it and go and join, for instance, the STO and Harisharan and others who were trying to help the tribals suggested that they should go and they should do a documentary, that they should allow them to do a documentary on their poverty and others, and so that they could be presented as presented to a Western audience, or at least the urban audience. And but they resisted. They said that they were not beggars, and they didn't want to move away even move away even from the place where they were staying, to more fertile lands. And that would suggest that their reluctance to move, their preservation of their own identity, is a form of resistance, which is different perhaps than the movements that we have talked about in Birsa Munda uprising.
Yes. So thank you so much, madam. You have been so generous to grant our request to come over here. And thank you so much for your brilliant presentation on this very interesting topic on Spivak and Mahashweta Devi. And of course, you can see the feedbacks. The participants are presenting or showing their feedbacks and their interest, whatever they have taken from you, madam. So, madam, from my core of my heart, I pay my sincere gratitude towards you to come over here and to just give us a beautiful presentation on this very interesting topic. Thank you, madam.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all the organizers, for inviting me. It was kind and your generous comments, but thank you very much again, and especially Dr. Samadhi Saha, who helped me so much. But I'm very sorry for the
No, madam. No, madam. It happens, madam. It happens. It is a part of our that technology. We are all techno migrant, madam. Don't worry about it. You just take care and stay blessed, madam. Take care of your health, ma'am. And in the
Thank you.
near future, please, we will be again in touch, madam, with you to just talk to you and to just share. I hope that you will share your valuable knowledge with us in the near future also. Okay, madam. Uh, Take great care of yourself, madam. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
madam. So, my dear participants, this is the end of this particular session. And you all know that at 5 p.m., that is in the evening, we will come again with the question answer session with Professor Francis Xavier Clooney, Parkman Professor of Divinity from Harvard University, USA. Till then, you just take a break, have a cup of tea, and come again at 5 p.m. with us to enjoy that question answer session. Till then, goodbye.